structure and I mean those sorts of usual concerns. But it is just the 7 verses, so I think we just better served by just going ahead here. So here's Psalm 110, starting with the superscription that's there in the original text. A Psalm of David. The Lord says to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. The Lord sends forth from Zion your mighty scepter. Rule in the midst of your enemies. Your people will offer themselves freely on the day of your power in holy garments. From the womb of the morning, the dew of your youth will be yours. The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever, after the order of Melchizedek. The Lord is at your right hand. He will shatter kings on the day of his wrath. He will execute judgment among the nations, filling them with corpses. He will shatter chiefs over the wide earth. He will drink from the brook by the way. Therefore he will lift up his head. So, I mean, it's so triumphant. And I mean, you can see why this psalm gets picked up. Just like especially in connection with Acts and the proclamation of the ascension at Pentecost. It's just interesting, though, thinking about it in terms of that, Old Testament setting, just how many things you've got going on here. I mean, it's not even just, that it's like, okay, we're talking about like a king, but the king, you're a priest forever. So we've got like a priesthood idea in here. Melchizedek, that's not something that's terribly common in the Old Testament in terms of allusions there. So that's pretty noteworthy all by itself. You've got the people presenting themselves in holy garments. So, I mean, like, there's a lot of things going on from an Old Testament perspective. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right.
This guy who comes from out of nowhere, and great father Abraham has this huge victory over Sodom and Gomorrah, and for almost inexplicable reasons, other than the fact that he's a priest of the God Most High. This is all in Genesis 14. He gives him 10% of all he's got.
Right.
And so there are so many layers to this psalm. It's fascinating.
It really, layers is a good word for it, and you're right. It's not to say that there's so many layers that it's like impossible to appreciate from an Old Testament perspective. I don't think I don't think they would have put Psalm of David in some ways at the top. If it was like, oh, we just can't even figure out how it applies to David. It's just too many things are going on. So I mean, there is a lot, but it isn't incomprehensible, and yet it does seem like it is kind of going in that direction of it's kind of the biggest and broadest and most magnificent terms, such that it seems to be pointing in this direction that even eclipses David, right? I mean, and I think that's in a sense what you have going on. That's not too. So it's not illegitimate then when this gets applied elsewhere, right? I mean, because it's really striking when the apostles bring it up and they say, okay, well, so this is stuff that's said about David, but then again, not even David really lived up to this.
Great David's greater son.
Yeah.
As great as David was, it's kind of one of these things. As great as David was, David could not carry this guy's sandals.
Right.
And that's really, the one who this psalm is ultimately talking about. As great as David was, arguably the pinnacle of Israel's history. This guy who is to come and who will sit on David's throne as his heir is so far beyond what David is too.
Right. Well, so then speaking of David and trying to make these connections here, let's go back to the top here. So you have a Psalm of David, but then right away this is something that doesn't really get carried through in the English translation. You can just kind of breeze right through it. The Lord says to my Lord. And just it's that part, right, that gets cited in Matthew 22, Mark 12, where the Lord is making the point. Now, hang on a second here, right? Like, who's talking to whom? And he's making a lot of hay just really about that part. And it is noteworthy even apart from that because it doesn't just say, in the usual Hebrew, like, says the Lord this, right? I mean, this is Neum Yahweh. This is oracle of the Lord, prophecy. I mean, this is very striking language at the very, very beginning, even before you get to the quote itself. The one that says, "The Lord says to my Lord."
Right. Well, Yahweh says to my Adonai. And so you have, it's amazing. So you already have, my goodness, maybe we should, as deep as this is, maybe this should be the Psalm for Trinity Sunday. Where you have this more of the divine staff meeting, like we would have dropped in on in Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 through 28. The Lord says to my Lord.
Right.
So Yahweh says to my Lord, and if this is of David, who's David talking about? So you're right. So you've got communication. This is communication within the Godhead. This is a huge deal here, and you run the risk of it gets so deep that you run the risk of inheriting the mental blue screen of death if you try to run this through the IBM the computer. You get the little spinny thing, and you go, we can't go much farther than that.
Well, so yeah, and I think that there's a really interesting thing when you do put this in Greek, right? That's where it starts to feel very meta, right? Because I mean, it's in the Greek, right? That you get the Lord thing going on, right? In Greek, it's ipenokyrios tikiriomu, and you're just like, hang on a second. There's too many lords here. What does not compute. What's interesting though is in the Hebrew. I mean, one, like you said, it doesn't say, the Lord says to my Lord. It's the actual divine name here, Yahweh. And then the other thing that's interesting too, right? You're right that the word is, Adonai, but the Masoretes, in their pointing of this, have deliberately, it's an interesting move that they did here. It's I think people are familiar with the phenomenon of how they changed the pointing, the little vowel marks underneath, when it comes to Yahweh, so that it's the vowels of Adonai. But they went further, and whenever you have the word Adonai occur in the scriptures, if it's not referring to God, they change the last vowel so that you don't get confused and think that refers to God. Because even just saying Adonai became a little bit too much. And so they actually pronounce this Adoni, which is not the original form of the word, but it's just their way of saying, hey, this is referring to a human guy and not God, which is pretty interesting then, because I think then that you've got the kind of next level reading that we were just talking about that the Greek really lends itself to, but in the Hebrew, it seems like it's saying this is a prophetic oracle that was given to my Lord, namely David. This is what he said to my Lord David, which is definitely a way that he was addressed, as my Lord by his servants. And so on that level, that's where you can kind of come back down to earth and say like, oh, okay, wait, that kind of makes sense. Like this is like what God is prophetically saying to David, and like, oh, okay, this is you can kind of like see the story and the logic here then.
Absolutely, absolutely. So this is, so this rather, there is an argument that can be made that this is, when we go back to the superscript, a psalm of David,
right?
Not necessarily the one that David wrote, but it's one about him.
Exactly.
This is where it could be some sort of, as I know one commentator would put it, a court poet wrote this about David rather than David, strumming along on his lyre, coming up with the next great, the next number one hit on the psalm chart.
Oh, okay. I'm too amused by that chart. Okay, I got it. No. It's like it's my.
I'm a preacher and a dad.
See, no, that's the thing though. It's like my dad funny bone is just resonating too much, and I'm like, I'm gonna have to use this now on everyone in my family. So okay, but yeah. So you've got that, and it is really interesting though, because like with that Hebrew pointing, right? Like you can't interpret it as David speaking and him saying, "The Lord said to my Lord," because who is King David's like non-God human Lord when he is ruling? No one. I mean, it's pretty interesting to stop and think about that David, I mean, like in his setting, it's like he answers to no man. I mean, of course there will be men that God uses in the form of the prophets to call him to account, but he's just answering to God. So I mean, that is really interesting that it's not even just as you pointed out, the kind of the flexibility of the terms Lord, but then at the beginning, how it's like, is it about David? And so it's someone talking about him, someone else, or is it in David's voice, strumming along to, the next big hit? So yeah, so you've got that kind of ambiguity that you have that enables kind of the next level reading. When you have the sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool, then. So it's like, those are the two levels. On the one hand, he's saying this to David. This is like, which really just kind of lines up well with the stuff that you have going on when, God makes his promises to David to bless him and give him success and all the rest, right? Okay, yeah, that makes sense. But then the next level thing of, hey, there's going to be a future victorious Lord who's even greater than David, who's going to have even greater levels of success, and he's going to even vanquish his enemies even more effectively than David. And that's where this heads then into like the messianic side of things, because I mean, what human Messiah was greater than David?
Right. Yeah, and so yeah, there's we're going to get to the bottom of the hour, and we're not even going to get through the first verse.
Yeah. Well. I guess the last thing that we'll say though, I mean, in terms of like usage then of so we talked about the first half of the verse, but then like the second half. I mean, this is the part where it just shows up all over the scriptures. I mean, this is where you've got in Hebrews that. This is like the idea that the Lord, the Christ, is greater than the angels. This is, we already mentioned that last part, until I make your enemies your footstool. So this is just where, the idea is this is referring to the resurrection, that the enemy that's been made the footstool is actually sin and death and the devil, which get conquered in that triumphant resurrection moment.
So you have these great enemies that, from a human perspective, are inconquerable.
Right.
These will be these insurmountable enemies. I used a line in my sermon yesterday, preaching on Romans 5, where it talks. We talk about being born. When the womb opens up, what you can see directly out of it is the grave staring at us. And yet and that is an insurmountable enemy from our perspective, until this greater Lord comes, and goes down into that grave, lays in its gullet for 3 days and then bursts forth to kill it. And when those enemies, when you have this Lord who can put those enemies under his feet, boy, now we've got a kingdom that will indeed never end.
Indeed. And well, so something you said that is making me just kind of ponder here. It's interesting when you think about applying this in the Messianic interpretation to Christ, in terms of the language of "sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool," because I feel like this is a kind of like an ascension moment. It seems, where it's like, here, come up here, David. I'm making you king, and you're going to be king, and just watch. I'm going to prosper you and give you success, right? And yet, right, like this is just interesting, because like if this is a triumphant moment of Easter, that it's like in some ways that's before the ascension, right? So it's like, how's the sit at the right hand logic, like, you think, working there when Peter's speaking in Acts chapter 2?
Well, I think when you get there, I wonder if it's a situation where at times we're guilty of compartmentalizing it.
Yeah.
Where we're thinking, well, this is ascension and this is,
Yep.
And really you have this contiguous eternal victory that exists.
Yep.
And we need to, and again, this is one of the dangers of studying small pericopes.
Yeah.
Because we get so lost in the weeds of that particular pericope that we become disconnected from the whole, from the salvation story. Not in a bad way, but we get, oh man, and you get it becomes addictive almost. You just keep going deeper and deeper and deeper.
Yeah.
And oh my goodness, and then you look back, and now you're so far down this hole that
yeah.
Oh, wait a minute. Oh, I every once in a while we got to come up for air, and we got to see it, and we need to see it in the whole picture.
Yeah.
And when he's okay, we can talk about this in the Easter language and the Ascension language, because they're all part of the same process.
Yeah.
And you're looking. Think about this. We spread these out by 8 weeks. Right?
Yeah.
We spread these out by 8 weeks. And we pull them apart and we delve deeply into them, and it's still, in the grand scheme, a relatively short period of time.
Well, no, that's right, and then like, just to kind of highlight that, when we do read Luke, you look at the way that Luke presents it, and and Luke's the guy who like actually tells us, right? There's like a 40-day period in Acts, but in Luke itself, this is interesting. I was talking just the other day to somebody about this, but in the Old Testament, the form that the historical books take is that of like it's like epic poetry, right? It's a Hebrew genre, but it's kind of sort of analogous to what you have in like the Iliad and the Odyssey, where it's like this big, like epic poem story of a historical happening of some kind. But in the New Testament, the Gospels are not epic poems. They're, if you have to call them anything, they're more like sermons. However, that doesn't mean that you can't have poetic flourishes, like you were just mentioning, like the poetic flourishes that we preachers put and use in our sermons. And so, even though they're much more conversational than epic poetry, it doesn't mean they're without poetic features. And in Luke, one of the poetic features is that he makes it seem like the ascension and the resurrection happen on the same day. It just goes boom, 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 and it's kind of all part of the same thing. And in Matthew, part of his poetic freedom there is that he doesn't narrate an ascension. It's just the ascension is the same thing as the resurrection in Matthew, where he is raised from the dead, and what's he say? He's there with his disciples. All authority in heaven and earth has been given to me. I'm already ascended, and I'm right here. Look at me. Here I am with you to the end of the age. So, there's a lot going on, and I think that's the complementary perspective you were saying we got to come up and look at that. We shouldn't be, splitting all these hairs like, well, no, that happened at the Ascension, and that happened at Easter. Well, from this other perspective, it's all part of the same thing. But
and that's beautiful. It needs to be, our study of this needs to be both and.
Yeah.
Our study needs to have a general overview.
Yeah.
To get the perspective of the Heilsgeschichte, the salvation history. But we also then, when there is great value in drilling deep into a text, because now all it's kind of like creation. I'm just use this as an analogy.
Well, now hang on a second here. I'm sorry to cut you off here. I want to hear the creation analogy, but it's time. We're already past time for our break. Everybody, hang on. We're looking at Psalm 110 here. We're going to get back to a note about creation when we get right back on here on Thy Strong Word.
St. Stephen's Small Saints Learning Center is dedicated.
All right. Hi, everyone on Facebook. Sorry again for the volume being too low on the guests there at the beginning. It was only for a minute or two, so fortunately, it wasn't that I waited till the halfway point to catch that. But yeah, really cool. I wonder if I can just pull up the Hebrew text here, because it is really, really quite interesting. Yeah, so here you have it in the Hebrew, and so this word here, this is the of David part, which shows you kind of the flexibility. It's vague whether this is la, da, weed. So it's not clear whether it's David's in the sense of it's about him, or whether he's the one who's speaking. And then this is the part we were talking about. This is Na'um Yahweh. There it is. The four letters, that is the name of God. But so it's not even, actually, there's no verb here even. It's not even God says this or said that. It's just Yahweh's oracle. So, it's a very striking way. It's used a lot in the prophets. But so that this is a prophecy on some level, you can see how that really just lended itself then to the preaching of the apostles. So, so lots of really, really cool stuff here just from the very beginning in the first verse. But let's talk about the second verse now when we get back. Welcome back, everybody, to Thy Strong Word. I'm Pastor AJ Espinosa. We're looking at Psalm 110 here, a short psalm, but one that is just packed full of awesome stuff. We made it through verse 1, because we are spending the whole next week, just one verse at a time. No, we're actually going to get through verses 2 to... Yeah, I know, that's right. Yeah, we just, our guest didn't realize this, but, here we have Pastor Nathan Metter on with us for the next 7 days. He's a pastor at St. John Lutheran Church, but they gave him a little mini sabbatical here out there in Plymouth, Wisconsin. So, yeah, brother, I'm sorry for interrupting you, but you were drawing a connection here. We have there in verse 1 this... this until I make your enemies your footstool, and how that's kind of, ascension and Easter language. But we were saying how, really though, there's a whole perspective in the New Testament even where even at the moment of the resurrection, he's already ascended in power and authority, and it's all poetically, you can see how it's part of the same thing.
Sure, it's poetically, and I think there is, there's something for us to understand when we're digging into this. There is something magnificent about drilling deep, but you also, to keep it in perspective, there's an analogy I think is helpful when you think of the vastness of creation.
Yeah.
Okay, you have this vast universe, and yet at the same time you have these minute details. That's one of those things when I'm teaching, either my confirmands or we're talking about the nature of God. This God we've got is pretty amazing. If he can put a creation that is this vast, where we can look at we've never once from the Hubble telescope seen the end sign.
Yeah.
But at the same time, on the back of your hand, you have a cells, millions of cells that have a unique DNA code in your hand.
Yeah.
So you have this. So I think it's important for us as we look at this story, as we look at the story of our salvation, the history of our salvation. There's a 35,000 foot level that this is what, and again, this is what God is doing.
Yeah.
This is not David. This is not Espinosa. It's not Metter. This is God's doing. And yet, when you dig into this, you see how intricate. He's not just kind of waving his hand from a million miles away. He is deeply involved, directly involved, orchestrating every little nanosecond of the plan,
right.
which is amazing.
Yeah, no, and I appreciate that, and I think I agree with the idea of the comparison to creation. It reminds me, sometimes. I had this, this thought. It was just maybe a couple of years ago that it's funny because there was an assumption that was going on for centuries that humanity was, pretty much in the center of the universe, right? With this kind of a geocentrism idea, and it was very disturbing, I think, when it kind of was shifted around, and it was like, no, hang on, what? We're actually going around the sun, not because of not because of oh well, I mean we're untethered here and I'm going to start to get dizzy, but because I think people kind of rightly were starting to think, now hang on a second, if the center of creation from God's perspective is this moment with humanity, right? If Christ becoming if God becoming man really is the second article that's in the middle, right? It's like the hinge on which everything turns, right? It's just I think it fell off to a lot of people that, somehow all of a sudden it's we're a side note or a footnote or something like that. But it's weird because when you were talking about, the size and scale, there is a sense in which we kind of are still actually in the middle of things, in the thick of things, because when you think about, how big the universe gets, and how many, 10 to the, nth power size of things, we're really, really tiny. But when you think about, you were saying, the cells on the back of your hand and how tiny things get, and you get down to even further into molecules and atoms and, quarks and all the rest, we're giants. And so when you just kind of line up the scale, the log scale, we're kind of there in the middle actually still. And so it's really kind of helpful to kind of have both those perspectives, that on the one hand, we're giants, and on the other hand, we're ants. And you kind of have to have that kind of balance when you're looking at this stuff. I think that's well said.
Nephilim and Lilliputians.
How fantastic, the Lilliputians of Lilliput. Very good. I like some literature reference there. But before we get too far afield, everybody, I do want to make sure to not neglect, if you have any questions for me or Pastor Metter, they do not have to reference Gulliver's Travels or anything like that. Just any questions at all about the text here, you can give us a call, 1-800-730-2727, or if you're in St. Louis, 314-821-0850. Also emails to kfuo@kfuo.org, or any questions or comments there in the live stream box on Facebook, facebook.com/AJ Espinosa. Also, thank you, Lutheran Heritage Foundation, their website, lhfmissions.org. Thank you for underwriting thy strong word. So I think that we kind of appreciated that, that verse 1, those different perspectives on it. Okay, we got to look at verse 2. So this is then where you get the scepter, right? And that's actually the first word there in the Hebrew, which is kind of interesting, the focus, on the scepter. But so you have this, scepter being sent forth, right? Which is, again, just kind of, I think, this idea of, like you were saying earlier, it's God's who is the one who's doing the work here. So it's God sending forth David's scepter, right? So that he rules in the midst of his enemies. It says your people will offer themselves freely. That idea, I think that God is just kind of bringing all of this about. And so it's really interesting, all these blessings that are named here in verses 2, 3, and 4. Of 3 being also having this one, it's interesting here. The dew of your youth will be yours. And then in 4, this, you are a priest forever. So just these blessings that just come out in 2, 3, and 4, God's bringing them all to come to pass. But we got to kind of take a moment and stop and think about, so what are these blessings really? There seem to be maybe 3 of them in view, if not maybe actually 4, 5, or 6. But how do you break down these blessings and what this poetic language is trying to get at?
Well, we've got so much of this here. It's almost overwhelming. But so you see, and we see this play out. He's going to have this. He's had this place of rule provided for him.
Yeah.
I'm going to send. He's sending out the scepter. Okay, and with basically what you're saying, without your doing it, you're going to get. There is this clothing aspect, this garmenting, and we see this playing out in David. Eventually David reaches the point where he kind of runs out of enemies to conquer, and people start coming to him, and the tributes start coming to him without him going out and shedding blood to get it, and then you have this. The issue that I'm struggling with a little bit, even honestly, this womb of the morning and the dew of the youth.
Yeah.
But then 4 is I'm not going to change. The Lord is not going to change his mind. I've chosen you. I'm not going to change your mind, which is important too. From David's standpoint, because from the Davidic standpoint, because David has his moments where he probably should have been forgotten. There are utterly forgettable moments in David's life, but this greater David, he's not going to. We're not going to worry about that, because he's going to be this Messiah, this Savior, this one who's going to rule over those enemies of sin, death, and the grave. And in addition, he's not only is he going to be a ruler, he's going to be a priest. And then he invokes this crazy name of Melchizedek.
Yeah.
The Mela Zadik, the king, Melach, king, and Tzedekah, righteousness. He's a king of righteousness who, like you said, you read Genesis and you go, who is this guy? He is this complete non sequitur that drops into the middle of the story and then just as quickly disappears.
Right.
He comes in, he gets the tribute from Abraham, and we don't ever hear about him again.
Right. Well, I mean, and it's interesting. You mentioned that part of the story too, right? I mean, it's an interesting story because what's the tribute about? And I think we kind of forget that, and I think it's like it's just I feel like this verse that you're referencing there with the story of Abraham offering the tithe to Melchizedek. It's half the time it's used, it's talked about in the context of like stewardship and tithing, right? It's like, hey, Abraham tithed, so it's good enough for Abraham, guys. So, and but we kind of leave out the rest of the story as you were kind of referencing earlier, where I mean, so what is he tithing on though, right? Well, he just went and kicked some serious behind. Yeah, I know, right? I mean, his nephew was in trouble, right? And so he's like, oh, okay, well, I'll just, call on my army because, I got an army here because I'm just one of the wealthiest men in the universe. And so Abraham goes and he takes his army and he goes and he just, mops the floor with these several kings, right? Just because, my army's bigger than all of their armies put together. No problem. So, I mean, it's interesting because I think that, by bringing up this Melchizedek thing, it's kind of showing this like kind of greatness, this like it's the kind of the dew of the youth and the priest part that's kind of like a little bit out of left field. But even there in our English translation, rule in the midst of your enemies, like what does that mean exactly, right? That he's going to be ruling, he's going to like set up a throne there, like in enemy territory. Well, I think that's like a little bit of what might be not so obvious, because that word there for rule, it's kind of the word for rule, but also kind of like subjugate or like tread down. It's kind of like trampling a little bit. And so I think the idea is it's like he is actually taking, in the midst, like from the enemy heartland, which is what you see that you got under King David. There's this expansion that happens, and he takes these enemy strongholds that before it was like, there's no way, that's in the middle of their territory, there's no way we're going to take that. But he's able to. And so this idea of this kind of great conquest, like, Abraham-esque, conquering these kings kind of idea. I think that, that might be one of the ways that this isn't maybe so left field when you're talking about the greatness of the conquest and the expansion.
Well, and I think that's the point. You think about, how long had they been in the land, and the Jebusites were still there.
Yeah, that's right.
They were one of the ites that were supposed to be eliminated, and they didn't cut any deals with the Jebusites. They just couldn't take them because it was up at the high point.
Yep.
And they controlled all. They held the most sought after ground because it was the most easily defended. And guess what? Now David comes in, and
Yep.
you're going to rule from there in the midst of your enemies. Now, again, then you look at this. You look at this again in light of what we talked about in verse 1 from a messianic standpoint. You're going to rule in the midst of your enemies. You're going to subjugate them. They're going to be your footstool, and not just the gladiator one time put your foot on them, but no, they're going to become permanent furniture.
Yeah.
Your enemies are going to be that permanent foot. This is not going to be there's not going to be a situation where they rise up again. You're not going back to the days of the judges where the Philistines are a pain in your rump, every 40 years or so. No, this victory is going to be perfect.
That's right. Well, so then this is really interesting. So I think that really gets brought out here, that he goes and he takes this territory, and the big one, of course, is he actually takes the city of David. Which is why it gets called that. He actually is able to rule from Jerusalem. It wasn't even called Jerusalem, I don't think, and until he actually goes and takes it. When you're reading Joshua, it's just there's that place up there that we can never conquer, right? So he pulls this off by God's grace here. So you can kind of see that there in the beginning and the end. This just we've overcome this. But then here in this middle part in verse 3, there's this. It's all this priest language, which is really interesting. But then Melchizedek is a priest, it says, and it's you are a priest forever. So what's this? The priesthood thing seems kind of out of place, because it's he's the conquering hero and the one who's going to foreshadow the victory of Christ, which of course, think about how Christ rules in the midst of his enemies. He's lifted up there on the cross, right? And John's already seeing the ascension happen, ruling in the midst of his enemies, ruling in the midst of death. So yeah, we see that rule and that conquer. He's prefiguring the Messiah. But how is the priest stuff worked out here?
Well, and again, and this is where when you have the priest involved, now the king rules. We get that.
Yeah.
We understand ruling, because we are people of the law. We all have the opinion. We have the opinion of the law in us. We get the law and order.
Right.
Okay. We may be short on it in some areas right now, but we get it.
Yeah.
All right. But the reality is, when he starts introducing the priest language, what does a priest do? The priest makes intercession and sacrifice. This is the idea of priesthood. This is not Father Phil from up the hill. What you've got is the idea of the priest. Again, I'm Gen X, so deal with the analogies. I like the idea of the. If you think of the old days of our lives hourglass, sand through the hourglass, these are the days of our lives. Where does the priest fit in? There's that little neck that connects the two little globes. And nothing gets from God to the people or from the people back to God except through the neck that is the priest. Okay? And he is, and the thing is, the priests, in the Old Testament, this is a priest. They understand the concept of priesthood, but the problem is the first priest, Aaron, dies.
Right.
And then he has, and he has kids. Well, and then so there's an order. So not only is the first priest, he's not only is a Levite, he's an Aaronite. He's a descendant of Aaron. Okay, but the problem is these priests, they have to, there's a long, elaborate ritual, and as you're getting near the, as you're surfing through Exodus and you start moving into the other, in my devotions late last week, I don't know how many times I heard the term, the long lobe of the liver, that were being burned up and things like that.
Yeah.
But then you realize there's this elaborate ritual that the priest has to do for himself before he can even be that for the people.
Yeah.
Okay, and then this priest is going to die. Well, this new priest, this priest that the king is going to be permanent after the order. He will be that one who makes intercession, sitting at the right hand of God, ascension language, theology of prayer language. We have and he is the one who then also makes this great intercession, this great sacrifice for us.
Yeah.
Which ultimately is the action that defeats the enemy. So he is in this priest, and he is this king of righteous.
Yeah.
Who also happens to be a priest.
That's right.
And in Genesis, and where does Melchizedek reign? He is the priest of Salem.
Yeah.
Salam. Peace.
Right.
Shalom. Peace. He is the king of peace. Well, what is Jesus? What's one of the names for Jesus in the New Testament? Prince of Peace.
Right.
Okay, he's in this order. So we're just layering here. It's fascinating. It just blows your mind. And yet this priest, because God's not going to change his mind. He's not going to change his mind. This womb of the morning, dew of your youth, it will still be yours. You're not going to get old. Okay. You're not going to get old. You're going to stay in this position because we're not going to need another priest after this one, because he is then book of Hebrews. He is this great high priest who is not unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, which was like us in every way, meaning he was like David in every way except one without sin.
Yeah, no, that's. I mean, I like the way you're connecting the dots there, because of course, we talk about that when we're going through our theological, like just systematics, where we're just saying, there's the threefold office of Christ, prophet, priest, and king, and here, look at that. In this psalm, we already have all three of those. We had the prophetic oracle, right? The Lord, Neum Yahweh, oracle of the Lord, prophetic oracle of the Lord. There you've got, him as king, and then him as priest. And so, I mean, in that way, like, I think on the level two, it really does, connect the dots to how this is foreshadowing Christ, as you were saying, like, as intercessor. Ultimately, it's interesting to consider like how David was supposed to be a priest, and what exactly that means. And it's actually kind of helpful. You were mentioning, we're going through Exodus right now, and yeah, you see that in Exodus, even that in some ways it's as if God calls Moses, and he wants Moses to be priest king. He wants him to be the leader who is also going to be the one making intercession, right? But Moses is like, yeah, but that's a lot of responsibility, and all the intercession stuff, it means I got to do a lot of talking, and I'm so bad at that. And so you kind of like, well, fine, okay, we'll make Aaron do some of that stuff. And so Aaron then becomes high priest, as you were saying. But like in some ways, it feels as if it was not supposed to actually be split up this way, where you had, the one guy who's like in charge, like a king, like Moses or Joshua, and then you also have this priest guy on the side. Like it was supposed to be one guy. And so it sort of seems like this is a little bit what it's getting at, that like in David, you kind of have a little bit of this approaching of the reunification, that the offices are getting closer to being joined back together. I mean, because you do have David, the way that he does. I mean, just think about like all the Psalms, right, that do bear his name and they do seem to have his voice. How he is interceding for the people, right? He's interceding like on their behalf before God. So I mean, there really is this way that the king is in some ways fulfilling the priestly function he always really had, that he was always supposed to have. And just really quick before I turn it back over to you, because I want to get your thought on this. This is a translation of the Septuagint, so the Greek text of this psalm right here in the middle. this part that we were just looking at that's kind of confusing here. This is starting at verse 3. With you is authority in the day of your power, with the splendor of the holy ones. From the womb before the morning I fathered you. The Lord swore and will not regret. You are a priest for eternity according to the order of Melchizedek. And that's pretty interesting because actually, if you look at like the critical editions of the Hebrew text, there's maybe some indication that the Hebrew has gotten a little bit off, and that it actually does resemble what the Hebrew equivalents of this Septuagint text are. So could it really be here that the point is you've got this authority and the splendor, let's say, of the holy ones, which could be referencing the angels, and then from the womb before the morning I fathered you, right? I mean, this I feel like actually is a very nice dovetail into why this gets cited in Hebrews, and why you would use this psalm to prove that he's greater than angels. Because, I mean, here it's saying, like, you're the king, and this was my plan from all along. Before you were born, when I was making the angels, I was thinking about how you were going to rule. Right? I mean, which is really something. And you can see how that's even true of David, how he's all part of this big master plan. But it's, of course, it's only ultimately true of the one who actually was fathered before the angels.
Correct. So maybe even here we have a better reference, an additional reference to the virgin birth. Where the conception of the Son. When he's coming in, it's not just the Isaiah, but you're right. I love this. I love this depth. And, he's going to make him, for a time, I'm going to make you a little lower than the angels, but, but you're still going to be this priest, and it's not when you get in the book of Hebrews where you're unpacking this whole Melchizedek thing, it's not verses, it's chapters.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
we're looking at verses, and the guy, and okay, just to be intellectually and theologically honest, whoever the author of Hebrews is, he goes on and on and on about this permanent priesthood. So basically, I like what you're, so what you're saying, so what we're looking at here in Psalm 110, when we think of David as a type, and Jesus as the final type, the greater, David becomes the one who acts as the beginning of the unification. Of prophet, priest, and king.
Yeah.
But it will not reach its fulfillment until Christ then becomes that ultimate confluence of those three strands that we've seen throughout the scriptures. God's prophetic oracle, God's prophetic oracle, God's reign as king, and the intercession of the priest.
I think that really wraps up like kind of the whole thrust of the thing, because in verses 5, 6, and 7 it kind of goes back to, more of this shattering kings and judgment. I mean, it's kind of more of the conquering language, though, with a little bit of a, maybe that we'd make the connection of like the second coming of the Lord. But kind of, it's more of the king idea. But I want to see if, just really briefly here, I'll take a quick stab at like an email question that was coming through, because I think you kind of already answered it for us. Kind of talking about this, the way that this is all described, it's very, prosperity and beauty and in tribute and gifts, right? Is that prosperity, prosperity gospel then? And like, well, no, because as you said, it's worldly prosperity that David enjoyed, but to prefigure the gifts and prosperity of the gospel in Christ, the spiritual blessings. So, just like you said, really just pointing the way to Christ. All out of time, as you said, we would run out of time very easily. Thank you so much, brother. Until next time. Everybody, that was Pastor Nathan Metter, St. John, Plymouth, Wisconsin. Until then, peace.
To Thy Strong Word, produced by the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod Office of National Mission in cooperation with Worldwide KFUO, the official broadcast ministry of the LCMS. Your support is vital for this program to continue. You can make a gift safe, secure, and easily online at KFUO.org. Thank you for listening and supporting Thy Strong Word.